Hi, my name is Elise, and you're listening to Chatterbox Island English Podcast. Hello and welcome back to Chatterbox Island English Podcast. I'm your host, Elise. As always, we're gonna chat about different topics in English on this podcast.So in the last episode, we talked about ghosting and how to deal with ghosters. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, you should probably go listen to that episode after finishing this episode. And if you want to check out any previous episodes of this podcast, you can click on any platform that you're listening to right now.So for today's episode, we're going to talk about something that I am personally very interested in, which is how speaking different languages changes your personality. So basically, it means if you speak 2 or more languages, you have a different personality when you speak a different language.Now, I am assuming that you guys who are listening to this podcast right now are like me and you speak at least 2 languages, English and Mandarin Chinese, or even more. So I'm curious, do you feel that your personality changes when you speak different languages? For me, I definitely feel that way, and I have discussed this with one of my friends as well.I feel more open and outspoken when I speak English. Like I'm more straightforward when I speak English, whereas in Chinese, although it's my native language, I tend to be more subtle and indirect. I'm not sure if it's because of my original personality or it's because Asian cultures are just more subtle and more polite than Western culture in general. So, like I mentioned before, I've discussed this with a friend and he is American, but his family is from India. So English is his native language, but he can also speak a little bit of Telugu.Which is one of the many dialects in India. And he told me that when he speaks Telugu, he finds that his tone automatically becomes much softer and more polite, and his voice goes higher, which I think is super interesting. So, are there any scientific proof for bilingual or multilingual people have multiple personalities? The answer is yes. A psycholinguistic professor named Susan Irvin Tripp from UC Berkeley did a research, and she asked several Japanese American women to complete the sentences she gave them in both Japanese and English. And she found very different endings depending on the language that is used. So for example, she gave the beginning of a sentence that goes,When my wishes conflict with my family. One participant's Japanese ending was, It is a time of great unhappiness, whereas the English ending was, I do what I want. So as you can see, there are 2 very different reactions from the same person using 2 different languages. So in the Japanese ending, it's clearly more subtle and more obedient, whereas in English ending, it's more like assertive and more confident. And some psycholinguistics believe that it's because languages are connected with different cultures, and therefore people will behave differently according to the culture when they are using the language.However, not every multilingual is multicultural. So in the first experiment, the participants are Japanese American, so they grew up in 2 different cultures. They are Americans, but their parents or their family came from Japan, and they were already somewhat familiar with both cultures. But some bilinguals or multilinguals only learn their second or third language for certain occasions or purposes. So for example, you might learn English specifically for business purposes, and you are not actually very familiar with any English-speaking culture. So some professionals argue that it's not necessarily about the culture, but the context or the environment that you are in. And that explains why we behave differently, because you won't speak to your friends the same way you speak with your boss. In other words, a different language environment or situation triggers you to react differently. And of course, both assumptions and arguments could be correct. I personally feel that a language is more than a tool in communication and vice versa. So communication is more than just the language that we speak. So for someone who is bilingual or multilingual, his or her personality or the way they speak can be influenced by the culture of the language and also the context or the environment. And of course, the level of fluency in the language also matters, because when you are fluent in one language, you are more likely to show your personality through that language. So what about you? Do you feel like you become a different person when you speak in a different language? I can only speak for myself, and I am only fluent in English and Mandarin Chinese. I know a little bit of French, and I can understand a little bit of Hakka, but I'm not very fluent in those two languages. So, like I mentioned before, I feel more outspoken and straightforward when I speak English. Sometimes I even feel more comfortable saying something in English when it's too straightforward, or it might sound too blunt in Chinese. Like sometimes it's easier to say something in English, at least for me. And it might have something to do with the vocabulary or different expressions in the languages. So I am super curious if any of you guys experience the same thing. Maybe you're fluent in many different languages like Taiwanese, Cantonese, Spanish, French, or any different indigenous languages in Taiwan. And do you find your personality changes as you speak different languages? Feel free to leave a comment down in the YouTube comment section or the Apple Podcasts review section, and I would love to know. And that's all for today's Chatterbox Island English podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to our show on Anchor, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, KKBox, and SoundOn. You can also find our shows on YouTube and go on our website, that's www.eisland.com.tw for more information. I'm your host, Elise, and I'll talk to you soon in the next episode. Bye!